Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. In actual play, the most common tactic, obviously whether it's for offense or defense, is to win a pawn, and of course on the bad side to lose a pawn. Why is that true? Well, first of all, there's more pawns on the board than anything else. There's 8 pawns, there's only 2 at the most of bishops, knights, and rooks. And pawns are also very vulnerable. They're not very mobile, so they can easily be trapped or lost in a series of trades. It's pretty easy to lose a pawn if you're not careful. But on the other hand, when you buy a tactics book, like almost all tactics books don't have pawn loss sacks or pawn loss tactics in there, because when you lose a pawn, it's not very exciting and it doesn't sell a lot of books. There is an exception. My book, Back to Basics Tactics, has a few tactics in the book where you win a pawn, but I actually go out of my way to tell you, like, white to play and win a pawn, because if it's a tactics book and you don't tell them you're only winning a pawn, people think that's not the answer, because they figure, well, it's got to be something more than that. I'm not just winning a pawn. So you have to actually tell them you're only winning a pawn. I'll give you a couple examples of that at the end of the video. Let's differentiate between a tactic that wins a pawn and a sacrifice where you're giving away a pawn on purpose. So the most common pawn sacrifices are in the opening, and we call them gambits. So let's show some typical pawn gambits, which are not tactics to win pawns. For instance, in the Sicilian, white can play d4, and after c takes d4, instead of recapturing with the queen, can gambit that pawn with c3, d takes c3, knight takes c3. White has lost a pawn, but it's not a tactic by black. This is simply white sacrificing a pawn and hoping he gets enough compensation in terms of development and open lines. Same kind of thing for other sacrifices, e4, e5, d4, e takes d4, c3, which it could be a Goring gambit or a Danish gambit. If white now plays bishop c4 and offers a second pawn, this is a Danish gambit. How about when black takes a pawn? How about the poison pawn variation of the Nahdorf? Knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d, knight f6, knight c3, a6, bishop g5, e6, f4. If you ask Stockfish here, what's black's best move? You can see he's thinking queen b6 is one of the top moves. Bishop e7, the other main line. Queen b6. And now white could not sacrifice the pawn. He could play a move like knight d3, the main line being queen d2, queen takes b2, rook b1, queen a3. Poison pawn variation. Again, this is not a tactic by black winning a pawn. White can save the pawn if he wants to. He's just purposely giving it up for purposes of getting a lead in development. Okay, so we're not going to cover those kind of things. Let's look at famous traps in the opening where one side wins a pawn. Let's start with Legal's mate. Legal's mate is e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4. Oh, sorry, it doesn't play d4 in Legal's mate. Force of habit, bishop c4. And now we need a bad move like h6, knight c3, bishop g4, knight takes e5, bishop takes d1, bishop takes f7 check, king e7, knight d5 checkmate. You're saying, why is this a trap that wins a pawn? Well, because black has to go all the way and fall for the entire mate to lose, get checkmated. Actually, what's happening is after knight takes e5, black can come to his senses and realize if he takes the queen, he's going to get checkmated. And he can just take the knight and let white take the bishop. And this is where Legal's mate actually is only a win of a pawn. White has captured a pawn and then gotten a bishop for his knight. So he's up a pawn here with the lead in development and the bishop pair. He's got a great game. He's winning, but it's really only a win of a pawn. Same thing in the Petrov's trap. e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, knight takes e5, knight takes e4 question mark, queen e2. Well, if black's not careful here, he's going to lose a lot more. For instance, knight f6, knight c6 discovered check, hitting the queen. If the queen goes in the way, I take it anyway. Bishop takes, I win a queen for a knight. But what if black plays it perfectly after he falls into the trap? Knight f3, knight f6, knight takes e5, knight takes e4 question mark, queen e2. Now black could play something like queen e7, and after queen takes e4, play d6 to get his piece back, but white can guard the knight with a move like d4, and eventually black will be losing a pawn. Pawn takes knight, white could take with the queen or the pawn. And no matter how black plays it, he's going to end up down a pawn, and white can't win more than a pawn if black plays it perfectly from this position with queen e2. So really the Petrov's trap is a trap to win a pawn. It's just that very often black blunders and plays something like, let's say d5, and white plays d3. And now if black plays something like, bishop to d6, white can just play knight f3, and he's going to end up winning the knight for a pawn. So Petrov's trap is really a trap that could win a lot more if the defender doesn't play it right, but it's really a trap to win a pawn. How about, let's take a look at Cambridge Springs trap. Same kind of thing. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, knight bd7. So here normally white plays either e3 or knight f3. If he says, oh wait, this pawn's not guarded, the knight's pinned, and he plays pawn takes, knight takes, then here white thinks he's winning a pawn. He thinks he's got a tactic to win a pawn, but it's actually not a tactic to win a pawn. It's actually a tactic to lose a piece, because black can play knight takes d5, moving the pinned knight, and when white plays bishop takes d8, bishop b4 check, queen d2, king takes d8, and when the smoke clears, black's going to be up a piece. So this is not a line where white's winning a pawn. It's actually a line where black's winning more than a pawn. So we could put this under the not winning a pawn tactic. It looks like you're winning a pawn. If this position was a little bit different, let's say white plays knight f3 and black plays a6. Well, now this might work. Knight takes d5, and now white's winning a pawn, because if black plays knight takes d5, bishop takes d8, bishop b4 check, white can play knight to d2, and he doesn't lose the queen back. So that means once white plays knight f3, he is threatening to just take this pawn off, and black needs to save it with something like c6. To play a move like a6 doesn't work. We also see in Queen's Gambits that sometimes white gets removal of the guard possibilities to win a pawn. For instance, if white plays pawn takes, bishop g5, and black plays h6, white can play bishop takes knight, and now black has a bad choice. He can mess up his entire kingside with double isolated pawns and isolated pawns by taking with the pawn, or he can play queen takes and lose the pawn to knight takes d5. So one way or another, white's ending up with something nice here. So the move h6, of course, is not a good move in this kind of position. All right, let's look at the main line of the Roy Lopez. e4, e5 in the closed Roy Lopez, knight c6, bishop to b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castle, bishop e7, and now white plays rook e1. Why is this the right sequence? Well, if white had instead tried to win the pawn after bishop to e7, if bishop takes c6, d takes c6, knight takes e5, black can play queen to d4 here. And since the bishop's on the e file, if the knight comes back to f3, he can play queen takes e4, rook e1, move the queen out of the way, and black should be okay to get his pawn back. But if white instead guards the e-pawn with the move that we saw, rook e1, now he's threatening to do that. So for instance, if black castles, that's a blunder that loses a pawn. I've seen multiple games where class players have castled here, not realizing that they're losing a pawn, and the class player that they're playing against doesn't realize they can win a pawn now with bishop takes, d takes c6, knight takes c5, removing the guard. So this is a tactic that wins a pawn. Now queen d4 doesn't work. White can play knight f3, and now queen takes c4 is not possible because the rook's guarding it. And if black plays the terrible move bishop g4, what should white do? Well, now he's winning a lot more than a pawn because he has a counting tactic. A counting tactic is a tactic where you count exchanges or trades on multiple squares, usually, well, it could be on one square, but usually it's multiple squares. And if you come out ahead in the trades, then that's a counting tactic. Well, here the counting is on d4 and d1. White gets a queen on d4, black gets a queen on d1, white gets a bishop on d1, and the best black can do is try to get a pawn on e4, but even then he gets skewered, so he probably can't do that. And white's winning a piece. So that means that when white plays rook e1 here in the Roy Lopez, castles is just a mistake. Bishop takes c6 is the threat to win a pawn, so black has to play b5 so that the bishop can't take the knight, and now there's no threat. Black could just castle here. And if white plays c3, black has a choice of playing the main line of the closed with d6 or playing the martial attack with d5. Okay, now in the French, we see the famous trap where black tries to win a pawn and he ends up losing material in the advanced French. Knight f3, knight c6, knight f3, queen b6, bishop d3, Milner-Barry gambit. It's not a gambit because you're giving up the pawn right now. It's a gambit because you're going to give up the pawn later. What if happens if black tries to win the pawn now? Knight takes. Black says, good, I'm winning a pawn. White says, not so fast. Discovered check. Bishop d7, and now you should not take the queen because then you lose the bishop for nothing. You should take the bishop with check first, then take the queen. And white is just up ahead an entire queen for a pawn. Okay, so in the Milner-Barry gambit, why is it a gambit? Because black simply plays like bishop to d7. And now, if white tries to save this pawn, it doesn't work. Bishop e3 loses the pawn on b2. And if he tries to guard the pawn with a move like bishop to c2, let's let Stockfish show you why black is good here. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Knight b4, which is either stopping white from castling or winning the bishop pair. If white tries to take time to move this bishop, like let's say bishop to b3, black can play queen to a6, which Stockfish says is even better than bishop b5. And now he's threatening knight to d3 check, and white can't castle. So therefore, white has to give up the bishop pair, and this is bad for white. So the right line for white is to leave the bishop there and just castle. And now it becomes a pawn sacrifice. Pawn takes, knight takes, knight takes, queen takes. And here the main line is to play knight to c3. But you can see Stockfish says the Milner-Barry gambit's not that good. You can see it's about minus 0.7 here on the bottom. Okay, let's get rid of Stockfish. We'll bring the board back. What if white plays the main line on bishop e2 and black plays knight h6 and white ignores him and castles? Now black can play pawn takes, knight f5. Does that win the pawn? Stockfish, what do you think? Stockfish says, yep, -1 approximately. So therefore, castles was a mistake here. After knight h6, white has to do something else. He could play, there's a line where he plays bishop takes h6. Stockfish is saying the best move here is the move I've never seen before, a4. He does give bishop h6 as a move. He gives bishop d3, a delayed Milner-Barry gambit. He thinks bishop h6 might be okay. It is a line for sure. but castles allows black to win a pawn. So if you see this position, black to play and win a pawn, he's just going to pile up on that d4 square. C takes D, C takes D, knight f5. Didn't do black any good to take with the knight. If he plays knight takes d4, black can just play knight takes e5, or black could even try to transpose, with knight takes knight, although then white could play queen takes, and if queen takes, pawn takes, knight f5, then white can play bishop e3 because there's no queen to take on b2. So that would not be the right way to win the pawn. The right way to win a pawn is probably to take here. Let's ask Stockfish again. Stockfish, what should black play in this position? Stockfish says, okay, Dan, you got it. Knight takes e5. So if you didn't follow my analysis there, what I said was knight takes, queen takes, pawn, queen takes, pawn takes, knight f5. Now there's no queen to attack this pawn, so the bishop's free to move and guard the pawn. And he doesn't have to do that. He could play rook to d1 as well. So that's not the right move order for black. Black should take, and if take, play knight takes. And as I said, if he plays knight takes, play knight takes e5. All right, I promised you some tactics from my book, Back to Basics Tactics, which I published through Russell Enterprises. It's part of the Back to Basics series, which is more than just Back to Basics Tactics. There's other books in the series. Let's take a look here. Number 109. Let me bring it out of my library. Examine %109. Okay, white to play and win a pawn. So as always, when I do show a tactic in a video, you can pause the video and try to find the answer. White to play and win a pawn. So I'm assuming that you're going to pause around now, and if you're not, I can just go ahead and give you the answer. Well, at first it looks like everything is well guarded. It looks like, where could white possibly take a pawn? Knight takes h5, followed by a queen check or something. Doesn't work. Knight takes e6 is guarded. Queen takes b7 is guarded. Knight d5. He can take, and if I take back, his knight is pinned, but that's not winning a pawn. Well, the answer is the queen is overworked on c8. He's trying to guard e6 and b7. So white can simply play knight takes e6. Now, if black plays queen takes e6, then white has queen takes b7, forking the knight and the rook, and black needs to save the rook, and he has no way of saving the rook and the knight. If he just saves the rook, then queen takes knight check, and let's say queen d7, and white has won a pawn. So black could get a little trickier here. What black could try to do after knight takes e6 is play the Zwischenzug a6, hitting the queen. All right, so what should the queen do? Well, the queen wants to keep attacking this b2 square, so he has the same tactic. He can't do it from b6 or b4, so he has to play from b3. And now again, if queen takes e6, queen takes b7, black could try here to play knight to a5, and again trying to remove the guard. So white has to be a little bit careful here. What white could play is he could play queen check. Well, okay, so now if black brings the knight back to c6, white can just save his knight, let's say with trading it off for the bishop. Knight takes f8. On the other hand, if black plays b5 hitting the queen, then white could play queen takes a5. If queen takes e6, then maybe queen takes c7, rook c1, maybe queen to b6. And now black doesn't have much of anything. If he tries to remove the guard on the e-pawn, queen takes e4 check. White says, I'm up the exchange. Let's trade queens. Queen e3. So knight takes e6, a6, queen b3, knight a5. And the easiest here for white is to play queen a4 check. And white ends up winning a pawn. So it's white to play and win a pawn. All right, let's try another tactic from the book, number 119. Let's bring that in. Examine %119. Okay, again, white to play and win a pawn. This looks like an exchange variation of a King's Indian. So how would we get something like this? Let's try it real fast here. Let's go back and have a board. D4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, bishop e2, castle, knight f3, e5, d takes, takes, queen takes, rook there, bishop g5. Okay, and what's going to happen is eventually black's going to blunder and allow the bishop takes. I won't try to guess all the moves here. It would, black's supposed to try to guard this pawn. There is a line where he plays knight a6, castle, bishop e6, rook fd1. I guess black would have, we're going to play the line with rook e8. Let's do that. So black guards the pawn with rook e8, castle, now knight a6, rook fd1, bishop e6, rook d2, c6 to stop the knight from coming in. And now black needs to lose a tempo, so we got to do something kind of nothing. Rook b, it's white's move. Okay, he doesn't have to lose a tempo. Rook there, rook a d8, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6. That should get us pretty much to the same position. Let's go back and bring it out and see if it is. Examine, %, 119. Yeah, okay. Looks like nothing happened. All right, so this could be an exchange king's Indian. I'm sure it is. White to play and win a pawn. Again, if you'd like to pause the video, then you can see if you can find the answer. And now I'm going to assume that you have paused the video. Okay, we have the same kind of tactic as before to win the pawn. When I say the same kind of tactic, it's the very common tactic, which is a combination, well, it's not a combination, it's a subset of removal of the guard called Overworked Peace. Which piece does black have right now which is overworked? Well, it's this bishop on f6. He's trying to guard the pawn on e5 from the knight capturing it, and he's trying to stop the rook from winning a rook on d8. So what white simply does is he plays rook takes d8 first. Why rook takes d8 first? Because if he plays knight takes e5 first, black has this Zwischenzug rook takes d2, and now white's the one in trouble. After rook takes d2, bishop takes e5, white's just lost a piece. So what he does is he plays rook takes first. And now black has a choice. He can take with the bishop, he can take with the rook. If he takes with the rook, then rook takes, bishop takes, knight takes e5, wins the pawn. Yes, black could skewer the knights and double the pawns, but he'd have to give up the bishop pair to do that, and white would be pretty happy here. Let's ask Stockfish what white would play in this position. Stockfish says white should just go back his knight to g4, and he says black should not give up the bishop pair. He should play bishop d4 and hit this pawn, king c2, and white's ahead by about a half a pawn, which is what you'd expect if you're up a pawn and your opponent has the bishop pair, which is worth about half a pawn. Okay, notice if he plays knight f3 and bishop takes c3, giving out back the bishop pair, that's not bad either. They have, I guess he had played knight g4. Knight g4, right? Knight g4, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and now it says white's up by about 6/10 of a pawn. He has an extra pawn, but it's messed up, but an extra pawn is an extra pawn, as they like to say. All right, so what if black takes with the bishop instead? Bishop takes. Well, now white can still play knight takes e5. And again, black has this bishop f6. This is not nearly so bad for black anymore. Stockfish says that black has full compensation for the pawn. So even though white was to play and win the pawn, black has pretty much full compensation. In fact, I should probably go to the section of the book where I make notes for future editions of the book and say, I probably should note this, that even though white's winning a pawn, it's not enough to give white really much any of advantage here. Did white have better than to play rook takes d8 and win that pawn that way? No. And black has the better way of taking, which is with the bishop. Loses the pawn, but black has some compensation. Okay, so we've started by talking about the rarity of pawn-winning lines in tactics books, but the fact that they're not that rare in actual play. They're very, very common. So there's kind of a disconnect between what you're studying and what you're actually going to be doing. So it actually makes sense. I was thinking of writing a book on, white to play and win a pawn book, where every tactic in the book is to play and win a pawn. Why would I write such a book? Because there is no such book that I know of, and I like to write books on subjects where there is no such book. So, I like to fill in the gaps in the chess literature. To some extent, all my books are that way, with the possible exception of the one we talked about today, Back to Basics Tactics. And I do have some things in that book that you can't find anywhere else, like my chapter on counting. But all my other books, I like to think, can do something that other chess books don't. I try not to do things better. I try to do things that other people don't do at all. All right, so that was my idea, and we looked at gambits, and those are not tactics to win pawns. Those are just purposely losing pawns to get compensation. But then we looked at some opening traps where you do win a pawn, and we looked at a couple tactics from my tactics book to win a pawn, after the opening. All right, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Please pass word of mouth about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess, here on YouTube. If you'd like, you can subscribe to the channel. You can hit the like button. I think this is my 159th video. We cover about every idea for improvement that you could possibly want, ranging from thought process to time management to tactics to analysis to evaluation, famous games, my games, amateur games, me thinking out loud to play against the computer so you can see how I think, all those kind of things. They're all here on the channel. Hopefully you enjoy it. See you next time. Bye.